You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family, screamed Charles' father. He was angry with Charles. These were the words which Charles would never forget. From early in his life, Charles Darwin felt the presence of his father bearing down on him. The father was a successful and wealthy country doctor who had high hopes for his two sons. But Charles, the youngest, seemed to be the one who was less likely to meet his expectations. He was not good at Greek or Latin or algebra or really anything in school. It wasn't that he lacked ambition. It was just that learning about the world through books did not interest him. He loved the outdoors, hunting, searching the countryside for rare breeds of beetles, collecting flowers and mineral specimens. He could spend hours observing the behavior of birds and taking elaborate notes on their various differences. He had an eye for such things. But these hobbies did not add up to a career, and as he got older, he could sense his father's growing impatience. When Charles turned 15, his father became actively involved in his life. He enrolled him to a medical school in Edinburgh. But Charles could not stand the sight of blood. He would faint at the slightest sight of blood. So he had to drop out of the medical school. But once he was dropped out of the medical school, his father was worried about his future. So in order to secure his future, Charles' father got him a position at the church as a country parson. This was a very good offer for Charles because he would be well paid and at the same time he would have plenty of time to pursue his mania for collecting specimens. But the only requirement to attain this position was he needed to complete his degree. In order to complete his degree, Charles enrolled at the Cambridge University. Anyways, once again, Charles had to confront his disinterest for schooling. But then something beautiful happened. He started gaining interest in the subject of botany, and he also became very close friends with his instructor, Professor Henslow, because there was a natural inclination with Charles that he loved to collect specimens, he loved to be around, observe a lot of plants, and this was very natural to Charles. So this was one aspect during his degree phase which he loved the most. But somehow with enough hard work, he completed his degree, and much to his father's surprise, he had earned a bachelor's degree in arts by the end of the year 1831. So Charles was very happy that he had completed his degree, and then he thought that his schooling was over once for all, and then he left on for a long vacation towards the countryside where he would indulge himself in a lot of outdoor games and his outdoor passions. And he almost forgot about his future for the time being. Once Charles returned from his vacation, he had a surprise waiting for him. What was the surprise? It was a letter from Professor Henslow, his favorite botany professor. Professor Henslow had recommended Charles for a position of a naturalist. It was a position of an unpaid naturalist on the ship HMS Beagle. HMS Beagle was a ship which was about to leave England in few months, and it was on a voyage across the globe to survey different coastlines, especially the coastline of South America. So a part of Charles' job was to collect minerals and live specimens on his way and then send them back to England for examination. Professor Henslow was always impressed by Charles' skill of identifying and collecting plants. So this helped Charles to secure a position as an unpaid naturalist. This marks the beginning of the apprenticeship phase of Charles Darwin. So here is this voyage of the HMS Beagle, which describes the journey of apprenticeship of Charles Darwin. And I also happen to introduce you to the design of the apprenticeship phase in the journey of mastery. Actually, Charles was confused, as everybody, whenever a major crucial decision has to be taken about a career, all of us are confused at one point or the other. So was Charles. Charles was confused because he had never been to sea. He had never traveled by sea. And the other thing was, his father had already secured him a well-paid position as a country parson. And then he was also not a trained scientist, and he lacked the discipline for such a position. So Charles was actually confused, and he wanted to turn down this offer. And meanwhile, even Charles' father also did not want to send him. And Charles' father always wanted him a secure future for his son. But then, once Charles started to reconsider his decision, it so happened that he started, one thing Charles always liked was adventure. And he had a natural inclination to explore different plant and life forms. So this was a great opportunity to explore different life forms across the planet, and it would unleash a lot of possibilities of adventure. So Charles was excited on one end. So after reconsidering it several times and imagining the several opportunities that would unfold on the way, Charles finally asked one of his uncle to convince his father. Meanwhile, it would also be an opportunity for Charles to come out of the cudgel of his overbearing father. So he wanted a little bit of freedom to explore life. With his natural inclination for adventure, he thought of convincing his father, and he finally accepted this offer of his journey on the voyage of HMS Beagle. Let's explore the journey of HMS Beagle, for it is also the journey of apprenticeship of Charles. The ship set sail in December 1831, and almost instantly young Darwin regretted his decision. The boat was rather small. He was continuously seasick and homesick. His heart ached at the thought that he would not see his family for so long. He developed heart palpitations and felt like he was dangerously ill. The sailors sensed his lack of seaworthiness and eyed him strangely. Captain FitzRoy proved to be a man of wildly swinging moods, suddenly turning furious over the most trivial events. He was also a religious fanatic, and he believed in the literal truth of the Bible. And he almost deputed Darwin and told him to find in South America the evidences of the flood and the creation of life as described in Genesis. Darwin felt like a fool for going against his father, and his sense of loneliness was crushing him down. How could he endure this cramped existence for months, living on close quarters with a captain who seemed half insane? A few weeks into the journey, feeling somewhat desperate, he decided upon a strategy. Whenever he experienced such inner turmoil at home, what always calmed him down was to head outdoors and observe the life around him. In that way, he could forget himself. This now was his world. He would observe life on board the ship, the characters of various sailors and captain himself, as if he were taking note of the markings of butterflies. For instance, he noticed that no one grumbled about the food or weather or tasks or at hand. They valued stoicism. He would try to adapt his attitude in such a way that he would survive himself in the ship. It seemed that FitzRoy was slightly insecure, and he always needed constant validation about his authority and high position within the Navy. So Darwin would supply that to no end. Slowly, he began to fit into the daily scheme of life. He even picked up some of the mannerisms of the sailors. All this distracted him from his loneliness. Several months later, the Beagle arrived in Brazil, and now Darwin understood why he had wanted so badly to go on this voyage. He was completely mesmerized by the intense variety of vegetation and wildlife. This was a naturalist paradise. It was not like anything he had observed or collected in England. One day, on a walk through a forest, he stood to the side and saw most bizarre and cruel spectacle he had never seen. There was a march of tiny ants. Their columns over 100 yards long destroyed every living thing in their path. Now, everywhere he turned, he saw some example of the fierce struggle for survival in the forest with overabundant life. In attending to his work, he quickly realized that he also had a problem. All of the birds, the butterflies, the crabs, and the spiders he caught were so unusual. Part of his job was to choose judiciously what to send back. But how could he possibly distinguish what was worth collecting? He had to expand his knowledge. Not only would he have to spend endless hours studying everything in his sight on his walks and take enormous notes, but he would also have to find a way to organize all of this information and catalog all these specimens and bring some order to his observation. It was definitely a Herculean task, but unlike his schoolwork, it excited him. These were the living creatures and not vague notions in books. As the ship headed south along the coast, Darwin realized that there were the interior parts of South America that no naturalist had yet explored. Determined to see every form of life that he could possibly find, he began a series of treks into the Pampas of Argentina. He was accompanied only by the Gauchos. These were the local tribal people who helped him in collecting all kinds of unusual animals and insect specimens. Adopting the same strategy as he had applied on the ship, he observed that the Gauchos and their ways, and he also started fitting into their culture as if he was one of them. On these and other errands, he would be brave, facing and marauding the Indians, the poisonous insects, and joggers lurking in the forest. Without thinking of it, he had developed a taste for adventure that would have shocked his family and friends. A year into the voyage, on a beach some 400 miles south of Buenos Aires, Darwin discovered something that would set his mind to thinking for many years to come. He came upon a cliff with streaks of white amidst the rock. Seeing that there were enormous bones of some sort, he began to chip them away from the rock and extracted many of these remains as possible. They were of huge sizes. The horns and armor of what seemed to be a giant armadillo, the huge teeth of a mastodon, and surprisingly the tooth of a horse. When the Spaniards and Portuguese had first arrived in South America, there were no horses, and Darwin was shocked to see these fossils, which were quite old and predated their arrival. Darwin started to wonder if such species had died long before. The idea of all this life being created once for all seemed illogical. More important, how could so many species become extinct? And he also questioned himself whether the life on this planet was in a state of constant flux and development. Months later, he was trekking through the high Andes looking for some geological specimens to send them back. But at an elevation about 12,000 feet, he discovered some fossilized seashells and deposits of marine rocks which were surprisingly found at such an altitude. He examined them and surrounding flora. He speculated that these mountains had once stood in the Atlantic Ocean and a series of volcanoes thousands of years ago must have raised them higher and higher. Instead of the relics which supported the stories in the Bible, he was finding evidences for something shockingly different. The 4 years of this voyage and all his observations had distilled into him a deeper way of thinking. A radical theory took shape in his mind. Darwin speculated that these islands had been pushed out of water by volcanic eruptions. In the beginning, there was no life on this island. Slowly, birds visited and deposited seeds. The various animals arrived by sea. The lizards or insects floating on logs, the tortoises, originally of marine origin, swam over. Over a period of thousands of years, each creature adapted to the food and predators that were found there, hence changing their shape and appearances in the process. Meanwhile, the animals that failed to adapt died, like the fossils of the giant creatures. It was a ruthless struggle for survival. Life was not created on these islands at one time and for good by some divine being. The creatures had slowly evolved to their present form. These islands represented a microcosm of the planet itself. On the journey home, Darwin began to develop this theory further, so revolutionary in its implications. To prove this theory would now be his life's work and purpose. On September 1835, when the Beagle left the Pacific coast of South America and headed west for the journey home, they first stopped along the way at the Galápagos, a series of virtually unoccupied islands. These islands were famous for the wildlife, and nothing could prepare Darwin for what he would find there. Captain FitzRoy had given him 1 week to explore one of the islands, and they could be on their way. From the moment, this small land was something different, and it was crammed with life that was not like anywhere else. Thousands of black marine iguanas swarming around on the beach and in the shallow water, 500-pound tortoises lumbering about the shores, seals, penguins, the flightless cormorants, all were cold water creatures inhabiting a tropical island. By the end of the week, he had counted about 26 unique species of land birds on this one island alone. His jars began to fill up with bizarre plants, snakes, lizards, fish, and insects. Back on boarding the Beagle, he began to catalogue and categorize the remarkable number of specimens he had collected. To his surprise, all of them represented completely new species. He made a remarkable discovery. The species differed from island to island, even though they were just only 50 miles apart. The tortoise shells had different markings. The Finches had developed different types of beaks, each designed for a specific food on their particular island. As the journey progressed, Darwin noted some obvious changes in himself. He used to find almost any kind of work boring, but now he could labor all the hours of the day. In fact, there was so much to explore and learn, he hated wasting single minute of the voyage. He could identify local birds by their songs, the markings on their eggs, and their manner of taking flight. All this information he could catalogue and categorize in an efficient manner. More important, his whole way of thinking had changed. He could observe something and then develop a theory after even more observation. The theories and observation were feeding off one another, and he was being empowered and equipped with full of details. He was empowered with so many details and facets of the world that he started exploring and new ideas started sprouting up out of nowhere. Here was a life story of Charles Darwin in context of the apprenticeship phase in the journey of mastery. So we see that the entire voyage of 5 years on the ship HMS Beagle can be considered as the apprenticeship phase of Charles Darwin. So which was remarkable in the discovery of his theory of evolution, his theories on adaptation and extinction, so which have revolutionized the entire science, because most of the times when we think about how life was formed on earth, we can see the process of evolution which has a greater bearing in the evolution of different species and in the process of evolution. So the apprenticeship phase of Charles Darwin was considered a stepping stone for creating and preparing Charles Darwin towards establishing. He had to gain enough evidence, and it prepared him mentally, and a lot of things he had to discover in the process of his journey of apprenticeship that prepared him for his mastery and his life's purpose of his theories of evolution. The Origin of Species was one of the greatest work of Charles Darwin, and his discoveries led him to the theory of evolution. He was considered as the father of evolution. Finally, the HMS Beagle returned England after 5 years at sea. Charles hurried home, and Charles' father was astonished to see his son. He had been completely transformed both in body and spirit. He was able to notice a lot of physical changes in Charles. He could see his head had become large. And you should know that Charles Darwin is considered as a man with a highly evolved prefrontal cortex, and you could also see the enlarged frontal portion of his head. So Charles' father was surprised to see his son changed physically, and he could also notice several changes in his mannerisms. He could see a seriousness in his purpose, and his father could also read a sharpness in his eyes. This was completely in contrast with the man who was the young lost man who several years ago left for his journey at the sea. It was almost the entire 5 years the voyage of HMS Beagle had transformed his son massively. So the apprenticeship phase can also be called as the first transformation phase in the journey of mastery. And this phase also helps to train us to the reality of life. So this is Charles Darwin for all of you in the context of apprenticeship phase, which is a phase which submits one to the reality of life and also forms the first transformation in the voyage of mastery. This was the second chapter of mastery with the example of legendary icon Charles Darwin. In the upcoming video, we are going to learn the design of the apprenticeship phase and how it applies to the real life situation. Thank you.